Okay, so within that 60 days, there are six evaluation standards that need to be met. Number one is, when considering eligibility for special education, the evaluation must be done by a multidisciplinary team, or MDT. The team performs the evaluation of the child for suspected disability. Then, as a committee or a team, they make a recommendation about the eligibility for special ed services. In a multidisciplinary team model, no single person does the entire evaluation, and no single person makes the determination or recommendation for eligibility or services. The team uses a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather that relevant information, including like functional information, developmental information, information provided by the parent, outside agencies, etc. And that all of that collectively helps determine whether or not the child has a disability as defined under federal law, one of those 14 eligibility disabilities. And collectively, we come together as a team and a committee to make that determination. Standard 2 is that all the testing materials and procedures that are used and done for the purposes of the evaluation and placement will be selected and administered so that they are not racially or culturally discriminatory or biased. So when evaluators are selecting those tests, they have to show that the tests that are being used are not racially or culturally discriminatory. They can't use, they need to be able to, and they're trained in this, as you are, to select tests that are less biased than other tests for particular children. Unfortunately, all tests have some racial or cultural bias to them, and that's one of the weaknesses of standardized testing. However, some are better than others, and it's the responsibility of the school district and the staff people administering those tests to make sure they pick the ones for those particular children that are not racially or culturally discriminatory. And the people administering the tests should be doing that administration of the tests in a way that is not racially or culturally biased toward the children, including school nurses when we do our physical assessment and our history taking. So keep that in mind as you move forward with your physical assessment section of the 524 class. All right, the third is that, the third standard is that tests and other evaluation material have to be valid for a specific purpose for which they are used. And for a test to be good, it must have both validity and reliability. And validity addresses that question of, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? So for example, if a child is given an IQ test, we would want to know, is the assessment actually measuring the child's IQ, or is it measuring their ability to complete the test and not the IQ? So that's why tests go through these like rigorous testing procedures and statistical analysis to make sure that they are testing what we want them to be testing. Reliability, on the other hand, refers to the consistency of the results, so that every single time we administer the test, we get those consistent results. So if you were to test a child one day on a Monday for their IQ, that all things considered and all things conditions the same, the child would have the score the same exact number or around the same number if they were tested the same way on Tuesday. So that is the reliability of the test, that it's consistently giving the same results every time that it's given to different children in a similar situation. All right, Standard 4 says that tests and other evaluation material must be administered by trained and qualified personnel, and that those people who are administering those tests are using the instructions that are provided by the test producer. So for example, a school psychologist administering a psychological test, or a speech therapist performing a evaluation on speech and language, are doing those things based on their particular expertise. A speech and language pathologist should not be administering a psychological test, and a psychologist should not be administering a speech and language test. And a special ed teacher should not be doing an IQ test, for example. And evaluators must administer the test the way that it's supposed to be administered. And so, for example, I can't just give a test. If you had the ages and stages test, you wouldn't just hand it to the parent and not say anything. You would go through the process of doing it the way that you are trained to do it, and way that the instructions behind that standardized test say to do it. And that is so that it's administered the same way every time, graded the same way every time, and reported the same way every time. That standardization to testing, and that's for all of the multidisciplinary team members giving tests. All right, standard number 5 goes back to kind of that multidisciplinary team and says that no single procedure and no single test can be used as that sole criterion for determining whether the child has a disability or needs special ed services. The assessment must be sufficiently comprehensive and use a variety of tools and strategies to gather that relevant information on the child. And to the extent that the evaluation is performed is dependent on the suspected disability of the child, which we talked about earlier as well. We don't just do every single test on every child, we individualize it. But that the child is tested on all of the areas surrounding the suspected disability, and make sure that those have all been tested, so that we don't leave something out if we think that that is an area that a child should be tested on, including things like health, vision and hearing, social emotional status, general intelligence, academic performance, communication status, motor abilities, that kind of thing. Standard number 5 really speaks to this being a comprehensive assessment. And the components of a comprehensive assessment can include an individual psychological evaluation, including general intelligence, instructional needs, learning strengths and weaknesses, social emotional dynamics, a thorough developmental, social, and academic history based on interviews with parents and student themselves, if it's appropriate, a physical exam, which can include only a hearing and vision test, or a comprehensive physical exam, including, a whole history and physical. Specific assessments that relate to other areas of the child's weaknesses or strengths in their education. It can include classroom observations of the student in their current educational setting, including, this is called an ecological assessment. There might also be looking at their reading, writing, math, spelling skills, a behavioral assessment to see how the child's behavior compares to the norms of his or her age group. A speech and language evaluation might be used to assess their speech and language abilities. You might have a physical therapist or an occupational therapist performing an evaluation if there's an issue with their accessing, physical components or occupational components of their educational area. There also might be interviews with parents, teachers, as I said, students, anyone else who might be significant to gather information from. That's the comprehensive evaluation and assessment. And then Standard 6 says that all the tests to be administered must be done in the child's native language, and the reports have to be written also in the child's language and the parent's language. Then when the assessments are complete, the team and the committee, which includes the parents, meet to review the findings and make recommendations. And we know that once the child has been entered into special education services, begins receiving those services, we have the eligibility meeting first, and then we have a yearly review of the let me back up. First, the committee reviews to determine whether the child is eligible, first of all, for special education and related services. And then once eligibility has been determined and the child begins receiving those services, we create that educational plan for the child. It's called the IEP, or Individualized Education Program. And that must be done within 30 days of the IEP being held, the IEP meeting, and eligibility being determined. They have to have that IEP completed in 30 days. Then every year they will have an annual review to discuss the progress of the child's goals, the student's goals. Are they meeting those goals? Do they need to be reviewed or changed? And then every 3 years we redo a comprehensive assessment to be is completed. And so this is the triennial review. And the reason we do this is because what if things have changed in 3 years? What if the child has met benchmarks and met goals, and we don't need the same types of services, the same level of services? We don't want to just put this child into special education and then forget about them and not make sure that they are receiving the right services throughout their entire education. And once in a while, children are dismissed from special ed services and when they no longer need them. consortium. It's rare, but it does happen, and it's a really celebratory sort of thing. So you want to have those every 3-year assessments.